"We must leave now!" she cried, grabbing James and wrapping him in a blanket. As she hurried through the palace, her heart beat with fear. She carried James tightly and was so determined to protect him. But in her hurry, she tripped over a stone. James fell from her arms and onto the ground. The boy screamed in pain as the nurse picked him up, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, my prince," she whispered. But there was no time to stop. She ran from the palace with the injured child in her arms, running as fast as she could. In just 1 minute, if you believe Jesus is the Son of God, type "Thank you, Jesus" in the comments and share his love. In the palace of Ashwood, little James, the son of Prince Jethro, ran through the corridor. His small feet made quick, light steps, and his laughter sounded against the walls. At just 5 years old, James was a cheerful boy who loved playing hide-and-seek with the palace servants. He had a bright smile that warmed everyone's hearts, and everyone loved him. His grandfather, King Herod, was the first king of Ashwood. His father, Prince Jethro, was brave and kind, a man who loved and honored God. James' life was filled with love and protection, but things suddenly changed in ways no one ever imagined. One morning, while James played in the courtyard, a servant rushed into the palace with dreadful news. "King Herod and Prince Jethro have fallen in battle," the man shouted. Chaos erupted in the palace as everyone realized what this meant. Kenwood, enemies of Ashwood, had defeated Herod and Jethro in battle. They would likely come to the palace next to kill any remaining members of the king's family. It was a common practice in those days for enemies to destroy the entire family of a king to prevent anyone from claiming the throne. James' nurse, a kind woman who had cared for him since birth, heard the news and panicked. She knew that if the Kenwood came, they would show no mercy, even to a little boy. "We must leave now," she cried, grabbing James and wrapping him in a blanket. As she hurried through the palace, her heart beat with fear. She carried James tightly and was so determined to protect him, but in her hurry, she tripped over a stone. James fell from her arms and onto the ground. The boy screamed in pain as the nurse picked him up, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, my prince," she whispered, but there was no time to stop. She ran from the palace with the injured child in her arms, running as fast as she could. Years passed, and James's life was no longer the same. He now lived in a place called Kenty, a desolate and forgotten town far from his former life in the palace. His nurse who rescued him was more like a mother to him now. He never left him on his own. Sadly, his legs didn't heal from the fall when he was young, and this made him crippled for life. He could not run or play like other children. Instead, he spent most of his days sitting by the window, watching others go about their lives. And sometimes he carves wooden animals with his hands. James often wondered about the life he could have had. He had heard stories from his nurse about the days when his father Jethro was alive. Jethro was a hero, a man who had fought bravely alongside King Aaron of Maywood, a well-known and kind king. Why did it all have to change? James would sometimes ask his nurse. She had no answers for him, only sad eyes and a gentle hug. Though James lived a quiet life in Kent, he always carried a sense of shame. He felt forgotten, like a broken piece of bottle no one wanted. He had lost his family, his position as a prince, and even the use of his legs. The only joy in his life was the presence of his nurse and his cravings. Over time, his carvings became so beautiful that people from the village started buying them, and James was known as the boy who carves the most wonderful wooden materials. Children from all around came to see his work. Meanwhile, King Aaron of Maywood was having a casual picnic with his family one beautiful Saturday, when his young prince said he wanted a toy carved by the popular crippled boy some villages away from Maywood. "Papa, my friend Ben keeps talking about his cravings. I would like one for my coming birthday." "Really?" King Aaron asked. "Tell me more about this boy and his craft." And so the young prince narrated to his father everything he heard from his friend Ben. The king doesn't know why, but he suddenly felt drawn to the boy in question. He decided he was going to send some of his palace guards to gather more information, but he never knew he was the son of his long-lost friend Jethro. Jethro had been more than a friend to Aaron. He had been like a brother. They had made a pledge to care and look out for each other and each other's families no matter what. Until the tragedy that stuck with made Aaron believe that none of Jethro lineage survived the massacre. Some days after King Aaron sent his guards to investigate, they eventually came back the praises and a sample of his wooden carving. King Aaron was impressed and asked his guards to make sure the boy and his family was present in his little prince birthday party, and he would like to meet him. When James and Hannah, his nurse, heard the knock on the door, they wasn't expecting visitors. But he hoped it was someone who wanted to buy any of his carvings. He was even more surprised when he saw the royal messengers standing outside. "The king has sent for you and your family," one of them said. James' heart raced with fear. "Why would the great King Aaron want to see me?" he whispered to himself. He had heard stories about how kings are scary and kills other people who may be popular than them. Was this the end for him? With trembling hands, Hannah and James was helped into a cart, and the journey to Maywood began. The trip was long and filled with anxiety. By the time they reached the palace, James and Hannah was exhausted and terrified. He was carried into the grand hall where King Aaron sat on his throne. The room was filled with officials and guards, all watching the crippled man as he was placed before the king. Hannah knelt beside him. James bowed low, his face to the ground. "I am your servant," he said, his voice shaking. Kindly, Aaron looked at him with kind eyes and said, "Don't be afraid, James. I have brought you here because I heard about you from my son, and I would like to see you carve here in the palace." James couldn't believe his ears. "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" he asked, overwhelmed by the king's generosity. Kindly, Aaron smiled and motioned for some placemaid to step forward. "Zane," he said, "you and the others are to prepare the West Wing for James and his mother, but James will always eat at my table, like one of my own sons." After the meeting, the kind couldn't help but notice the familiarity from James. He could not shake it off, so he asked one of his guards to find our information about them and get back to him before 24 hours. The next evening, the kind summoned Hannah, James' nurse, and asked her, "I know you aren't his mother. I beg you to tell me whose and what family he is from. I plead you not to lie to me, because if you do, it'll have dire consequences." Hannah was terrified. She had vowed to take their secret to her grave, and yet she could not lie to the kind king that has treated them well since their arrival. So she told him of everything. Before she finished, kind Aaron was already in tears. He could not believe his friend's son was alive and crippled at that. Immediately he sent for James. Upon his arrival, he hugged him while crying and promising him to uphold his words to his father. In just 1 minute, if you believe Jesus is the Son of God, type "Thank you, Jesus" in the comments and share his love. James' life changed dramatically from that day forward. He moved permanently to Maywood, where he dined at the king's table alongside King Aaron's sons and daughters. He was treated like royalty, not because of anything he had done, but because of the covenant between Aaron and Jethro. Hannah was treating best too. James continued his carvings and became more famous. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of belonging and dignity. Though he was still crippled, he no longer felt forgotten or ashamed. His days in the palace were filled with gratitude and wonder. He never grew tired of sitting at King Aaron's table, listening to the laughter of the king's children and sharing in the abundance of the royal household. He marveled at the kindness the queen had shown him too. One evening, as James sat with the young prince and shared his story, "When I was younger, a sudden news came that my father and grandfather had died. Fear filled the hearts of everyone around me. My nurse, who loved me very much, tried to protect me, but in her panic she wasn't careful and I fell. That's how I became crippled." The young prince's eyes widened. "Did you forgive her?" James smiled sadly. "Yes, I did. She made a mistake, but it was because she cared for me. Fear can make us act without thinking, and sometimes our actions have consequences we don't mean to cause. James' life is a powerful story that teaches us that. 1. Fear leads to mistakes. The nurse who dropped James acted out of fear, and in her panic she caused an accident that changed his life forever. This teaches us to stay calm in difficult situations and make decisions with care, even under pressure. Negligence has lasting effects. Although the nurse loved James, her moment of carelessness had consequences that couldn't be undone. This reminds us to be mindful in our actions, as even small mistakes can have lasting impacts. 1. Kindness can restore a lot. King Aaron. Kindness and loyalty to Jethro restored James' dignity and gave him a new life. This shows the power of grace and compassion to heal wounds and bring hope. 2. Brokenness does not define us. Though James was crippled and lived in obscurity for many years, he was still valued and loved. His story reminds us that our worth is not determined by our circumstances or physical condition.